you would like to see book recommendations from Black content creators, here are 15 or so that I personally subscribe to that I would love to share to get you started. Please go check out their channels, which I will link below. Hey y'all, howdy, welcome to One for the Books. I'm Sandra Broadwell. As you know, if you saw my stats video for 2022 or my goals video for 2023, you know that one of my goals for this year was to read more diversely than I did in 2022. When I looked back on my year, I realized that about 78% of the books that I read in 2022 were from white authors. And I just want to do better. And so one of the things that I challenged myself to do this year was to lean into the themes that some months are assigned, like Black History Month, to get me to reach those goals. And I just thought this would be a fun challenge for myself. February is obviously not the only month that I'm going to be reading from Black authors, and I wasn't like going out of my way to find books by Black authors that I wanted to read. I have like over 300 books on my Goodreads TBR, and so I was just using these monthly themes to help focus which books I was picking out for this month. So I read exclusively from Black authors for the month of February this year, and that was a really fun little challenge for myself. So first, let's do a goals check-in. One of my goals for 2023 was that I wanted to read every book that I bought or acquired in 2022. So for that challenge, I read Black Leopard, Red Wolf this month by Marlon James. And another goal that I had for this year was for every author that I read in 2022 that was a new to me author that I gave their book 4 stars or higher, I wanted to make sure that I read another one of their books in 2023. So for the month of February, that author was N.K. Jemisin. In 2022, I read The Fifth Season, and this month I read The City We Became. So in total, I read 13 books this month, which is a lot, especially considering that February is such a short month. But I gravitated heavily towards very short reads this month, which was also a little bit outside of my norm. But the majority of the books that I read, 7 in total, were less than 300 pages. And then I had 5 books that I read that were between 300 and 500 pages, and 1 book that was over 500 pages. So let's get into the books. The first book that I read in February this month was Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. And this book was 5 stars. So just kicking off with a bang. This is about a Black woman named Dana who is living in 1976. She's a writer and she's just moved to her new home in Los Angeles. She suddenly gets pulled back in time and shows up and sees this young boy with red hair drowning in the river. And so she dives into the river to save him from drowning. Each time that this boy is in trouble, she gets pulled back in time again, and she slowly over time learns that she is getting pulled back to pre-Civil War Maryland, and this particular boy lives on a plantation. He is the son of a slave owner, and the people on this plantation are tied into her own personal ancestry. So time moves differently in the past than it does in the present in 1976. So each time that she returns, the boy is older, and he's turning out to be very cruel, just like his father, the plantation owner. And so she's trying to influence him to grow up to be a better person, but she's also just having a lot of questions morally about what it means for her to continue to save a person who is not necessarily a good person and who is inflicting harm on others, and especially harm on people that matter significantly to her. But at the same time, saving him might be the only thing that is ensuring the continued existence of her family and therefore herself. This story just wastes no time in getting right to the point. The morality is really complex and the emotional impact is very deep, but the story is told in a really straightforward kind of way, which I really loved. It's really obvious to me why this is such a classic, and I felt for Dana every step of the way. It really just made me think about a lot of things that I'm sure I will continue to think about for a really long time. So highly recommend and Kindred. It knocked it out of the park. The second book that I read this month was The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin. This is book one of the Great Cities duology, and I read both of those books this month. The premise behind The City We Became is that when a city gets old enough and has a high enough population and enough culture develops, that the city basically becomes sentient or develops a soul, and that its power is channeled into a human avatar. And so a human being suddenly is imbued with the power of a city, which is just a rad concept. The City We Became is about New York City specifically, and because New York City is so big and diverse, the city actually manifests as 5 different human avatars, one for every borough of New York. So there's Manhattan, Brooklyn, the Bronx, Queens, and Staten Island. That was really cool because they all sort of the avatars that it chose kind of embody the personality of those 5 boroughs. These people obviously don't know what's going on when they're suddenly imbued with these powers, but they start to realize, and they feel kind of gravitationally pulled towards the other human avatars of their own city. There is an alien entity that is trying to prevent cities from becoming sentient because it has an impact on the multiverse that they don't understand. So basically, as soon as these human avatars come into this knowledge and this power, they're immediately under attack. And so they have to seek each other out and band together to fight for the soul of New York City. And that's just such a cool concept. I was blown away by the imagination and the cool ways that the power of a city could be channeled through a person. There's also just conflict within the city because Staten Island is so different from the other 4. There's all this tension that they have to solve and figure out. It's really great commentary as well on gentrification and the sameness of cities, and that's one of the ways that the alien uses to attack cities and prevent them from being born is by the box storification, filling a city full of Starbucks and fast food restaurants and chain things that really destroy the character of small local businesses or the cool vibes that you get when you go into a place that feels distinctly like a certain place versus, the Anywhere USA feeling that you get if you're in a strip mall in Ohio. So this book overall, I felt was a love letter to cities, New York City in particular. I have never personally been to New York City, but after reading this book, I feel I know the city in a really intimate sort of way. And that was so cool. As an outsider, I can't even imagine how this book would feel to someone who actually lives in NYC. My brain was also just lit up so creatively while I was reading this because I kept imagining, well, what would my city be like if it had an avatar? Or what would my college campus be like if college campuses had avatars? And so just the fact that it encouraged me to think so creatively about my own life and my own places that I love, you just can't ask for a better reading experience than that. So this was hands down a 5-star read. All right, the third book that I tackled this month was The Space Between Worlds by Micaiah Johnson. I found this at a used bookstore, and it looks like it was a former Book of the Month pick, which was cool, but I tabbed it up. I really enjoyed this. This was a great 4-star read. So the premise behind The Space Between Worlds is that it's possible to travel between parallel universes, but you can only do so if the you of that universe, which they call your doppelganger, is dead. And so people who can travel to lots of different parallel universes are people who have died in most of their other lives. In this world, there is extreme disparities between the rich and the poor. There's actually basically a walled city where the well-to-do live, and then there's these outer lands that's kind of deserty where poor disadvantaged people live. And that's where our main character is from, and generally it's people from this kind of neglected wasteland who are selected to be multi-universal travel people because their lives have been so disadvantaged that they die a lot. They're exposed to extreme hardships like violence and drug addiction population and low access to resources and medicine and things like that. So here we have Kara, our main character, and she is determined to do really well at her job. She was recruited to be a traverser, which is this multi-universal traveler. If she meets certain standards at this company that she works for and she does really well, then she can actually become a citizen of the walled city. I can't remember the name of it, but she can actually like have a better life for herself if she does well at her job. And so that's pretty much all she cares about. Space Between Worlds title is kind of a play on words because Kara is from the Wastelands but works and lives in the walled city now, and so she doesn't really feel like she fits in either place anymore. But then obviously she's a traverser, and so she like literally travels in the space between worlds, and so that's kind of like a cool way that they came up with the title, I guess. She's really flirtatious with her boss, which is a woman named Dell, but Dell is really hesitant towards her and seems to always like rebuff her and treat her like she's lesser, which is a really interesting relationship dynamic that develops throughout the story. Basically, as Kara attempts to move up and do better in her company, she starts to learn some secrets that are very dark about what her company is really up to and what they're doing in these other universes and how it's affecting the world that she lives in. So she has to make a decision about whether it matters more to her to make a good life for herself or basically make sure that the lives of people in other multiverses are good. That's a funny way to say that, but this has a lot of commentary on like nature versus nurture and the power of our choices and how they result in like all these ripple effects that affect our lives, and also just like the relationships that we seek out and how those affect our trajectories in the world. It had a bit of a slow start, I thought, but by the end I was like turning the pages like it was my job. I really loved the way that this picked up in the second half. I was worried about it being a cliffhanger because on Goodreads it said it was book 1 and there is no book 2 yet, but it's really a standalone book and I definitely highly recommend. All right, next up, I read The Birds of Opulence by Crystal Wilkinson, and I picked this up for 2 reasons. One was because the fact that it was an autographed copy. It was a book I've heard about like a lot before, and the reason I've heard about it so much before is because it's written by Crystal Wilkinson, who is a literary author that lives in my city and has been really hyped up to me by several of my friends before, just that her writing is super beautiful. So I was very excited to read this. This ended up being a 3-star read for me. I would say 3.5 stars, but it is historical fiction. And first of all, Crystal Wilkinson is definitely a powerhouse. Like the writing is beautiful, but this is set in the fictional rural town of Opulence, Kentucky. It follows several generations of women in the Good Brown family. They all suffer from mental illness, and it's about how they cope or suffer with it, and about their neighbors and their community who help them or judge them or make their lives harder through these various trials that they go through. I would say be sure to check content warnings. This is a very sad story, beautifully written, light on plot, very much a character study. I feel like the ending comes kind of without any real resolution, which was probably the point, but isn't really what I look for in my stories. And so for me, this was a 3.5-star read, not because it wasn't good, but just because it's not what I look for when I'm going into a book. If you're into character-focused studies and like melancholy vibes, I would say definitely check this book out. It could be a big winner for you. Okay, and then we have to talk about Black Leopard, Red Wolf by Marlon James. This was a huge miss for me. I read the whole thing, which I'm kind of proud of myself for, but also like kind of hate myself for not just DNFing it, because I questioned basically from the get-go why I was still reading this book. I even started to record a vlog because I was just so upset by what I was reading and I didn't know how to handle it. But basically, this book has every content warning you can possibly imagine. Every type of sexual assault that you can dream up is in here. An extreme focus on male genitalia and just like really gratuitous violence. The magic system was really interesting, but the characters just sucked. Like I hated this, honestly. I don't have anything nice to say about it other than the writing was good and the author clearly had like a specific intention about what he was doing. But I would never, ever recommend this book to anyone. And it felt like a giant waste of my time. I actually started this book before all of the other ones, and it took me that long to get through it that I didn't finish it till like the middle of the month. And normally I read a book in like 3 days. So yeah, deeply disturbing. Not worth it. All right, next up, I read Riot Baby by Tochi Onyebuchi. This was great. I only gave it 4 stars, and I think that's on me because I did not realize it was a novella when I picked it up. I thought it was a full-length novel, and so I felt like I was reading and I was just getting to the good stuff, and then it was over, and I was like, wait, what? I thought I was going to have like 3 times this amount of content to read through. And so, that's on me. That's not the book's fault. I just, I checked it out from Libby as an ebook. And so I just didn't realize how quickly I was flying through it. The reason that I picked up the book this month was because I heard about this from Jessie over at Bowties and Books, or Jessie on YouTube. They announced 2023 Blackathon. And in that video, they talked about Riot Baby as one of their books for a specific group. I didn't find out about this until we were already a lot of the way through the month. So I didn't actually participate in Blackathon, but now I know, and we'll look forward to participating in that next year. I will link that announcement video down below. But anyway, Riot Baby is one of the books that they recommended, and so I was excited to pick this up. This book is really about a pair of siblings. Ella is a girl growing up in Los Angeles in the 90s, and she has the power to see the future of individuals that she interacts with. And she also has other powers that are very varied that grow and develop as she gets older, and those are sort of revealed to you more and more as you read more of the story. And then her little brother Kev is the other main character, and he was born during the Rodney King riot in the 1990s. But that was obviously a very formative experience for people living in that area at that time. Ella ends up running away from home to try and learn how to control her powers without hurting anyone, and Kev is left on his own to kind of grow up. Their mom's around, but she's working so many jobs, and so Kev ends up dealing with a lot of stuff on the street and gets incarcerated. This story it's really about Kev, I would say, more so than Ella, and it's just about him. While he's incarcerated, he gets like psychic visits from his sister, and all of this is pretty much said in the plot synopsis, so I'm not really revealing anything, but it's really just like a powerful commentary on police brutality and the American prison system and the surveillance state and racial inequality. And I thought it was so well done, and it was so interesting. Probably would have given it 5 stars if I felt like the plot was just starting to get really good and really start to develop, and all of a sudden it was over and I was like, no, I want more. So that's always a good feeling to be left with. It just wasn't what I was expecting, but it was really, really good. Next, I read The Final Strife by Sarah El Arifi. And this is not the cover that I recognize. I've seen lots of other booktubers talk about this book, but I'd never seen this cover before. I found this at Half Price Books, and I actually don't like this cover as much as the normal cover that I see for this, which I guess I'll put here. But the inside of this book is gorgeous. Can you see how beautiful she looks? Oh, I can't get enough of this. Every time I opened this book to read it, I just stared at her for a while because I was just like, oh, she looks so cool. I wish this was on the cover instead of this, but I'll take what I can get. So basically in The Final Strife, there is a kind of caste system. It's based on what color your blood is. So folks who have red blood are like the rulers of society. Folks who have blue blood are kind of the laborers, and then folks who have clear blood are servants or slaves, basically. The premise of the book is that 18 years ago, this resistance group stole 12 of the red children and brought them to be raised by blue families, and then basically did a child swap. So there were 12 blue-blooded children that got set to be raised by red families and 12 red-blooded children that were set to be raised by the resistance. And so the idea behind this was that if the reds grew up seeing the world the way blues do and saw all of the inequality and oppression that their people faced, that they could help overthrow the reds. So really cool premise. Of course, our main character is this woman named Sila, who was one of the stolen reds, who was raised by the resistance movement, but she is haunted by this previous failure that she had where a bunch of her family and friends in the resistance were killed and it was her fault. She has turned to drug addiction. She chews on these like joba seeds. They like stain her teeth red, which is really gross. And she basically like ekes out an existence kind of drifting around and enrolling in these fighting rings because she's an excellent fighter, having been raised by the resistance movement. That's kind of where our story starts, and I won't really say too much else about it, but it was super, super fun. Definitely a 4-star read. The thing that kept this from getting a 5-star for me was I just wasn't a huge fan of the writing. It felt very YA in terms of the writing style, but then there was like sex and drugs and violence and things like that. So I guess this might be considered a new adult type novel just based on the way it was written. So the writing didn't really vibe with me. I thought the characters were really immature at the beginning, but the character growth and the character arcs that happened within the story were so excellent and super worth the payoff. And I think the sequel to this book called Battle Drum comes out later this year, and I am like really stoked to get my hands on that when it comes out in a few months. Okay, so after that, I read a book of poetry called Reparations Now, and this is by Ashley M. Jones. So I heard about her back in 2021, I want to say, when this book first came out. I think I read an article that was talking about like Alabama's first Black poet laureate, and I was just like, ooh, I love discovering like cool new poets. So I immediately ordered her book, and then it sat on my shelves until this month, pretty much. I did read, 7 or 8 poems out of it previously, but I had not endeavored to read the whole thing. And I thought, this is the month. It's going to happen. And it did. I finished this collection of poetry this month. Reparations Now by Ashley M. Jones. I gave this 4 stars. Some of her poems in here were just masterful. I felt like she has so much anger and sorrow and pride, and the emotions in this book were really sharp and deep and fierce. And I just really could feel it coming off the pages. But I also had a hard time reading a lot of these poems back to back, which I know poetry is not really meant to be consumed like that. Poetry is more like a one-off and you absorb it and then you come back to it type of thing. But I did sit down and read this a handful of times, throughout the month. I felt like the poems didn't really flow together the way that I would expect a collection of poetry to work together. So it was just like some of them obviously were like very lyrical, and it was like reading a song almost. It was so beautiful. And then some of them were really stilted. I just felt like trying to read them as a collection rather than reading them one-on-one was just a little bit of a jarring experience. So again, there are some really great gripping poems in here, but overall collection gets 4 stars. Okay, next I read The World We Make by N.K. Jemisin, which is book 2 of the Great Cities duology. I would have read this immediately after The City We Became, but I was waiting for it to become available in Libby, so I had to wait. Luckily, it still became available this month. The World We Make, I gave 4 stars. Even though The City We Became was a 5-star read for me, I felt like The World We Make was definitely a product of the time that it was written during peak Trump pandemic era. And so that was unfortunate. I still thought it was just as imaginative and creative and as cool as the first one in terms of concept, but it just didn't hit for me the same way. And I think there was so many of the moment cultural references that were placed throughout this book that I felt like already felt a little bit last year. And because of that, I think this book will have less and less cultural and emotional impact every time that I read it in the future, which is a shame. Also, the big boss battle that it was building up to at the end, I felt like ended a little too abruptly for how much buildup there was. But overall, I still really loved it and was really glad that I read it. This series overall, I would recommend highly. Next, I read the Binti series, which is 3 short novellas, Binti, Then Home, Then the Night Masquerade. The premise for Binti is that Binti is a young 16-year-old girl. She is from a Himba tribe, which is a small African community that really prides itself on their really incredible tech innovations, but also their insularity and like strong community-ness. They have a lot of pride about being Himba people, and none of them have ever left Earth before. But Binti is really smart and can do some really incredible calculations in her head, and she is the first member of her people to ever be accepted to University, which is the most prestigious galactic university that exists. She really wants to go, but she's afraid of what her family will think and what her community will think, and if they will outcast her, cast shame on her for choosing to leave their community. And so she kind of runs away in the middle of the night to go attend this university. While she is on the ship on her way to University, her ship is attacked by aliens. So that's all I'll say. There is so much that happens because of these events, and where it leads is just crazy and cool, and there is just so much imagination packed into this tiny little novella, and I was just really wrapped up in this world and commend Nnedi Okorafor is the author. I think I forgot to say that at the beginning, but so rad. I gave Binti 5 stars. Like, wow. And then Home, the second book, is after Binti has been attending the university for a year. They have academic break, and so she decides to go home and face up to her family and her community, live up to the consequences of her decisions. So while she is home, she learns about a secret about her own heritage and her family's heritage that was kept from her previously, and that leads to some really interesting places. This one ends on a cliffhanger, and I definitely felt like the second story in Binti felt more like a chapter than a complete story. So number 3 in Binti is The Night Masquerade. In The Night Masquerade, a war is about to break out between these two groups, and Binti is really the only one who can negotiate between these two peoples because of these incredible skills that she has developed over the course of the previous 2 books, and these like special abilities that she has gained. This one took a turn that I did not see coming, and I didn't like it at first. So it kind of lost me in the middle, but then it gets twisted and turned, and like things happen, and by the end I was like super on board again. This one was my least favorite just because, like I said, it lost me in the middle. Part of what I didn't like also was that there was some grief because of some events that happened in this book, and I didn't feel like how the characters portrayed or reacted in response to grief was very accurate. So that just pulled me out of the story a little bit. I didn't think that people would actually act that way if they had just experienced all of this loss. Overall, I think I liked each one less than the first one, but like I said, Binti was 5 stars, and Home and The Night Masquerade were both still 4 stars. I still have lots to think about when I think about these books, so I would highly recommend this series. All right. Whew. Book number 13. We're getting there. This is Ring Shout by P. Jolly Clark. This was another novella, and the premise here is that demons who feed on hate have come through to our plane of existence and infiltrated the KKK. And they basically eat real Klansmen from the inside out and like take over their bodies. And so like demons have manifested through actual people's bodies and are demons. But there are people like our main character who have the sight, and they can see that these people are demons and not just like horrible people. And this is set in Prohibition era Macon, Georgia. And I felt like the setting in and of itself was its own character. The setting, the city that they live in, the places that they visit just like leapt off the page, and I felt so enraptured by it. I felt like I was really there. This is about our main character, Maurice, who is a monster hunter, and she, with her friends Sadie and Chef and their crew, they're all working to bring down these KKK demons. Maurice also happens to have a magical sword that helps her in this quest, but they find out that these demons are paving the way for something bigger and badder to come through into their plane of existence, and they need to find it and stop it before it happens, or, you know, the world will end and all that kind of good stuff. So despite the very short length of this book, the characters had so much depth and really unique voice, and I really felt like they all had very strong motivations, and it just felt super real. I was just having a great time while I was reading this. I don't know how else to say it. It's a horror story. So that's only the second horror that I've read in like the last 2 years, but I was just living for it. There were like Lots of body horror, guts strewn everywhere, mouths where there shouldn't be mouths, like all kinds of crazy stuff. And it was like super duper rad. I loved it. I had so much fun, and I definitely need more magical sword wielding, monster hunting Black women in my life because damn, that was so rad. Okay, so we've come to the end of my February wrap up. I had overall a really great month. Like I said, 3 5-star reads, a bunch of 4-star reads, 1 3.5-star, and then 1 2-star. I will say Black Leopard, Red Wolf at the end of the year, I'm sure that'll be in my worst reads of the year because, whew, buddy, that was a time. That was a time, but it does not by any means overshadow the really amazing books that I read this month. So I just had a really, really good month overall. Thank you guys so much for following along this far. If you are still here and you want to let me know, you can leave a little city or like a little skyscraper emoji in the comments below for The City We Became, which was one of my 5-star reads this month. Please let me know what some of your favorite February reads were, or if you participated in Blackathon, or if you have a really great Black author recommendation that wasn't listed in this video. I'd love to hear it. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me for a little bit today, and be sure to like this video if you enjoyed this content and subscribe to see more bookish content in the future, and I'll see you next time. Thanks guys.